Hello, I thought I would talk about the Guardian's view on the farmers' protest and the taxes imposed upon them, because it's quite representative, I think, of a lot of the left. And there's been much fuss about this particular article by Will Hutton, titled "Farmers Have Hoarded Land for Too Long, Inheritance Tax Will Bring New Life to Rural Britain," which is obviously a very infuriating title if you believe in things like private property or the right to inherit property between generations, which I think I certainly do. And his basic argument is exactly what is in the byline here, that prices and rents will fall under Rachel Reeves's plan, enabling a younger generation with new ideas to enter the field. And other than the obvious pun at the end there, he's obviously trying to make the point that there's an old class that are sort of gatekeeping young farmers away from the cost of buying land, which I don't think is how it works. The cost of land has shot up for a multitude of different reasons. One of the reasons land increased in price was actually that the nature of EU subsidies changed before we left the EU, of course. And then it was calculated by the amount of land you had, and therefore land became more valuable. Surprise, surprise. Also, the demand for land has gone up because there are more people in the UK than ever before, and these things make sense. And there's also the thing to bear in mind that farming is a sort of economy of scale, right? If you have lots of peasants with hand tools, it doesn't matter as much how big your fields are. Whereas now we use lots of big machinery, it makes sense that you would want to have much, much bigger fields because that operates better with the kind of machinery you have. If you've got very small fields, you can't use certain kinds of machinery. And it's also better and more efficient to have bigger fields to farm stuff. And so breaking it up and having lots and lots of smaller fields, which is actually what happened in the Soviet Union, will result in lower yields, which is not desirable. But I'm not necessarily focusing on this guy because he's just one man stating his opinion. And I think a much more useful thing to look at is opinion pieces written by the editorial team at The Guardian, because this represents The Guardian more broadly, because of course the people who choose the editorial lines quite often shape the nature of the publication itself. And it's titled "The Guardian's View on Taxing Farmers. Big Landowners Must Pay Their Share." And the byline there is, "Tax rises were needed, but Labour must not dismiss the difficulties faced by farming families." So I was actually a little bit surprised that they were as sympathetic as they were, because they're saying that, yeah, there are obviously difficulties here. We sort of understand why they're upset, but they're basically saying it's not great, no one wants to do it. However, it is necessary to pay for public services. And now I don't agree with this. I'm going to go through and read it and then pick out the bits that I take exception to and just break it down for you. So it says, "No tax change is perfect. Systems can never be customised to take in every set of circumstances. There are always edge cases, people who are outliers in the group, that new measures are aimed at. Several hundred farming families seem likely to fall into this category following the changes to inheritance tax in Rachel Reeves's budget that prompted this week's angry protests. Those whose income will make it difficult for them to pay the new 20% rate on agricultural property above a 1 million threshold may need to sell land or adapt their business in other ways." So you can almost see a little hint of sympathy here, can't you? Which again is rather surprising. It is later on that the more objectionable stuff comes in. And they're basically saying that there are some people that are going to get caught up in this new tax that they would argue it's not in the spirit of the tax to target. I would say that this is implemented to basically seize land from people who are not constituents of the Labour Party. Farmers are notoriously socially conservative, right-leaning, to the point where people just openly say so, and it's been a bit of a joke for a long time. They used to be a mainstay of the Conservative Party. And so I think that focusing on the test cases, there's some merit to that. However, feel like this is just trying to brush over the main objection to this, that the inheritance tax is unjust in the first place. It doesn't matter if it's farmers or not. People are rather married to the idea of you own a farm and you pass it down through generations and you build a connection to the land. This is something that I think is very much captured in the ethos of British culture. It is a sort of defining thing, our connection to the land, and it shapes who we are as a people. And I think that although people might not articulate it in that way, there is some sort of unconscious understanding of this. And to take that land away in a way that is entirely arbitrary, in that, they just said arbitrarily we're going to have 20% and we're going to charge these people, there's not necessarily a justification. They're just saying we need the money, therefore pay up, which, if it were a mafia doing it, people would obviously be more sympathetic to the victim of this crime. But because it's the government, all of a sudden, it's just like, well, it's essential public services. Well, maybe they could run those better rather than stealing people's land. But anyway, there's more to get through here. It carries on to say, given that farms were previously exempt, it is not surprising that this has caused upset. Very few people want to pay more tax. I certainly know that much. Taxation is theft after all, especially on family-owned assets to which they are attached. Now this is a little bit insidious. It's their property. It's not that they have it's not the emotional attachment, it's that the government has no claim to it. It's their property, they bought it outright. The government can't just say, well, I'm sorry, you died, you can't pass that on to your children, pay us. Everyone knows that that's unfair. That's why people are taking exception, as well as the fact that farming is already a very difficult industry to make a lot of money in, and putting additional financial burdens on farmers is already pretty unreasonable. And it carries on to say, there is a reasonable argument that more notice should have been given of the government's plans, which were not in its manifesto. And I have to credit them there for pointing that out, that they did introduce this, and it's a major change to the way the British economy works, and it wasn't in their manifesto. So, yeah, fair enough. Although I don't think these plans should have gone ahead at all. Had a consultation taken place, it is possible that the 1 million threshold might have been set higher, given the average size of a farm. And I actually addressed this in one of the segments in the main channel, that you can get a flat in London for around £1 million. That's relatively small. It wouldn't be suitable for raising a family in necessarily. So £1 million for a farm, which, farms tend to be a bit more sizable than a flat, funnily enough, or an apartment, is quite low. And it does seem like it's targeting a very large swath of farmers, which is one of the points that Jeremy Clarkson made at the protest, actually. And it carries on to say, once business property relief changes on assets apart from land are factored in, it may be that more farmers are affected than the Treasury expects. That is almost certainly the case. They tried to trot out this figure, which turned out to be fake news, and actually a Labour activist, I believe, or someone Labour affiliated came up with it, that it would only be 500 farmers a year, and the BBC published this, and that actually had to be retracted. But it carries on to say, this is concerning and should be examined, but couples can hand on 500,000 each to their children, so £1 million between them, in addition to agricultural holdings, meaning that the total value of a tax-free inheritance could be 2 million or even 3 million. Now, it doesn't really matter if you can do some sort of legalistic moving assets around. It's not the government's to take in the first place, and making it more complicated is just frustrating and annoying, is needless bureaucracy. Saying that people can do this but they have to do some extra things is not really that helpful. It's their property. They shouldn't have to jump through a bunch of legalistic hoops to pass it on to the next generation. There has to be a continuity between those who came before, those who exist now, and those who exist in the future, because that is how you build civilization. If any of that breaks up, then there's a problem. It carries on to say, tax rises were unavoidable given the desperate state of public services. Now, this is where I really, really start taking exception. No, they're not. Public services as well are awful in Britain. Truly awful. I wish I could opt out. There's no way of opting out. And the fact that they're just continually consuming more and more money, there are more and more people flooding in, and we just can't keep up with it. And the services are getting worse and worse as there's more and more demand. It's not money, it's the number of people in Britain and the fact it's state funded. There's nothing more to it than that. There's an incentive placed when you fund something by the government to make it dysfunctional, because then you get more money in from taxpayers effectively, which for employees of the state might put more money up for grabs for them. And it also makes their life easier because potentially they hire more people, that splits their workload, and so they can put their feet up. It doesn't necessarily happen in all industries, but it certainly happens in some, whereas the incentives in, say, a private company is that you make it as efficient as possible so you maximise profits, and the inverse is true of a state-run industry. So it carries on to say, there was no good reason why agricultural businesses should continue to be untaxed. Well, there is a very good reason, is that they're not very profitable, and if you tax them, the impact on the profits from the farmers gets passed on in the cost of the food. And also, if it stops being profitable for farmers to sell to people like supermarkets, who operate like a cartel where they say, we will pay this price for milk, we will pay this price for eggs, which may not even generate any profit at all for the farmer, what incentive do they have to continue making that food? Maybe they focus on exclusively profitable industries, but that might lead to farmers potentially not producing nearly enough food to supply the British public, which would be an utter catastrophe. Some might argue this is the intent of this whole thing. It carries on to say, on the contrary, the increasing use of land as a way for wealthy people to avoid taxes needs to be addressed. So this is where the sort of class resentment comes in that a lot of left-wing types have. They see it as all these farmers are aristocrats, and then they're doing it to avoid taxes. They don't pay their fair share. They're basically feudal lords, and that's not really how it works. Actually, farming's quite difficult. If you look at, how do I say this in a safe for YouTube way? People who opt out of living in this world, farmers tend to rank very highly in that. And it carries on to say, a far more targeted tax would have been tapered to take more from bigger, wealthier landowners. A more progressive budget could have incorporated this among other wealth taxes. And it's using the word progressive there to mean a tiered system. We have a progressive income tax system whereby you meet a certain threshold, and then your income above that threshold is incorporated into that tax band. It's not just, you earn £5 more and it tips you over into a new tax band, then all of your money is taxed. That's what that means. Although, if you don't understand that, that could be a little bit insidious, because they're suggesting, well, they're not going far enough. But I don't think that's what they actually mean directly here. So it carries on to say, while hard-working farmers are rightly respected by the public, their situation must not be allowed to mask the fact that the main beneficiaries of the existing regime are a highly privileged group. I don't really think so. I mean, they're very asset rich, but income poor. Monetarily, they're not making a massive amount of money. I know plenty of farmers. They don't go around, driving sports cars, not that they would choose to anyway. It's not like they're making a killing. I mean, there are plenty of people, say, in the Labour Party that make a lot more money. Politicians, for example, and civil servants tend to make a lot more money than farmers. If you wanted to save some money, perhaps some cuts to, say, politicians' salaries. Why not fire a bunch of bureaucrats? That might be a potential way of doing it. I mean, that's actually what I believe should be done. You massively cut the role of the state, because the state doesn't do things efficiently because of the incentives I mentioned prior. So between 2018 and 2020, nearly 600 million in inheritance tax relief went to about 200 estates with an average value of 6 million. Each claimed more than 1 million in relief. Even once the changes are brought in, agricultural land will be taxed at 20%, half the rate of other assets. Now, the just thing here is that the government shouldn't profit off of its citizens' death. You know, if someone dies, the government shouldn't get a payout from that, especially from, you know, the inheritance that grieving families will have to allocate to the state. That seems to me to be rubbing salt in the wound and a great evil, because it's already been taxed once, hasn't it? Taxed multiple times potentially to get to those people. Why does the government have a claim to it? I don't think it does. It carries on to say, and there's only 2 more paragraphs now, but the Tories' fiscal legacy is, as ever, only part of the story. And if ministers did not realise the political danger before this week of introducing changes such as these without warning, they must do now. Across Europe, farmers are a key constituency in the reaction against net zero and other green policies that are portrayed by populist right-wing parties as the projects of an urban elite. Where is the lie? In France and the Netherlands, among other countries, a large section of rural opinion has been harnessed by the far right. Now, this is a very insidious framing, actually, in that it's saying that the far right has gullibly duped these people into believing these things, whereas what's actually happened is that the urban elite that they mention has infuriated people to such a point that it has radicalised them against them, and that they actually hold deeply held convictions against them. It's not that, you know, they're just being harnessed, they have no agency over their lives. It's people actually standing up and resisting. You know, the farmers in the Netherlands, for example, weren't just harnessed by the far right. They started their own party and are now part of the government, and they successfully push back against things in so doing. And by framing it in that way, it's undermining the notion that they can actually do anything to alleviate their situation. It's trying to downplay it, basically. So the final paragraph says, to avoid something similar from happening here, Labour must show that it can listen to farmers not only on inheritance tax but also on the food system and other issues. Notice how they don't say to actually tangibly do anything, they just say you should just listen to the farmers. Because one of the things that Tony Blair actually pointed out, he was right to do so in a sort of evil Machiavellian way, is that if you tell people that you're listening to them and you're keeping their concerns in mind, well, it helps a lot to take the pressure off of you politically, because people feel like you might be doing something about them, or at least that they have been heard, and therefore they're not as angry at you. And that's one of the things that Keir Starmer has not done. He's just doubled down and refused, because he sees the farmers as an enemy, just like much of the white working class in the riots in August. And it carries on to say, they are not the party's natural constituency, but its newly elected rural MPs have a vital role to play in bridging the fissures in our volatile political landscape. The impact of new taxes must be scrutinised, and the opportunists who offer bitterness but no meaningful alternatives must be challenged. So that final line, again, is another very insidious thing, because what it's trying to say is, well, you either adhere to the olive branch that the Labour Party gives you, or you're going to be manipulated by very bitter people who mean well and are nasty and mean. And actually, no, that's not how it works. We've got examples from the continent where the farmers have been successful and resisted successfully against this. And to pose it in that way, in a sort of underhanded way, is very immoral, in my opinion. And so I suppose I may as well summarise my overall opinion of this, and I think that although it's trying to pose itself as being understanding of the farmers, it's not really got to grips with the moral objections to a lot of this. Obviously, there's also a good economic case against what the Labour Party is doing here, as well as a moral one. There's some attempt to try and meet people in the middle, stick out a little bit of an olive branch, which I think we shouldn't recognise as some sort of peace offering, but a sign of weakness, that we need to keep on pushing, and that we should not accept these terms, because the Labour Party, the state, they have no claim over your property. It is yours. You earned it, you paid for it, it stayed in your family.